October 1943, Camp Angel Island. The transport ship dropped anchor in San Francisco Bay as dawn broke over the water. Below deck, 150 Japanese soldiers sat in darkness, their hands bound, their futures uncertain. They'd been captured in the Solomon Islands after weeks of brutal jungle fighting. Now they were being brought to American soil as prisoners. Of the men had heard stories. Whispered rumors that spread through the holds of prison ships crossing the Pacific. Americans tortured captives. They desecrated bodies. They showed no mercy to those who followed the warrior code of Bushido. And for Buddhist soldiers, there was an even deeper fear. That their spiritual practices would be forbidden. Their faith mocked. Their sacred objects destroyed. Among them was Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto. He was 24 years old from a small village outside Kyoto. In his pocket, wrapped in oiled cloth, he carried a small wooden Buddha figure, no larger than his thumb. His grandmother had given it to him the day he left for war. She'd pressed it into his palm and told him it would keep his spirit centered, even in darkness. He'd carried it through every battle. Now, he wondered if the Americans would take it from him. The journey to this moment had been long and brutal. Yamamoto, who had enlisted in 1941, filled with the fervor that swept through Japan after Pearl Harbor. He'd trained for 6 months at a camp near Osaka, learning to fire the Arizaka rifle, to fix bayonets, to charge with the kind of ferocity the emperor demanded. But his grandmother had raised him in the old ways. She'd taken him to the temple every week as a child. She'd taught him to meditate, to chant the sutras, to understand that all life was suffering, and that compassion was the only path through it. When he left for war, she'd wept, not just because he might die, but because she feared what he might become. War strips away everything gentle, she'd said. Promise me you'll remember who you are. The Buddha will help you remember. He'd promised, though he hadn't understood what she meant. Not then. In the Solomon Islands, he'd learned. He'd seen men transformed into something barely human. Officers who executed prisoners without hesitation. Soldiers who took trophies from the dead. The brutality flowed both ways. He'd seen what American forces did too. The way hatred built upon hatred until the original cause was lost in the cycle. At night, when he could find a quiet moment, he'd hold his grandmother's Buddha and try to remember that world she'd described. The temple, the incense, the peaceful chanting. It felt like a dream from someone else's life. The hatch opened. Sunlight poured down. Guards shouted in English. Words the prisoners didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear. Move, now. They climbed the metal stairs one by one, blinking in the brightness, and emerged onto the deck. The San Francisco skyline stretched before them, impossibly tall buildings gleaming in the morning light. For many, it was their first glimpse of America. It looked nothing like the war-torn islands they'd left behind. The city seemed untouched by war. No bomb craters, no burned buildings, no evidence of the destruction that had consumed so much of the Pacific. Some of the prisoners felt anger at this. Their own cities were being firebombed, their families suffering, while American civilians lived in apparent comfort. Others felt something closer to awe. This was the industrial might they'd been fighting against. These towers, these bridges, this vast harbor filled with ships. Japan had challenged this. And the outcome suddenly seemed inevitable. They were loaded onto a smaller boat that carried them across the bay to Angel Island. The facility had been an immigration station for decades, processing thousands of Asian immigrants through its detention center. Now it would house enemy soldiers. As the Bari boat approached the dock, Yamamoto gripped the Buddha figure through the fabric of his pocket. Whatever came next, he would not let them take this. The island itself was beautiful in a way that felt cruel. Green hills rose above the waterline, dotted with eucalyptus trees that filled the air with their sharp medicinal scent. Seabirds wheeled overhead. The October sun was warm on their faces. It seemed impossible that this place was a prison, that they were captives. But the guard towers made it clear. The barbed wire made it clear. The armed soldiers watching them disembark made it very, very clear. The processing took hours. They were stripped, searched, deloused, given prison uniforms stamped with PW on the back. American officers moved through the lines with interpreters, taking names, ranks, serial numbers. The interpreters were Japanese Americans, Nisei, and their presence created a strange tension. These were men of Japanese descent who'd chosen America. Some prisoners saw them as traitors. Others simply found them confusing, evidence of a world more complicated than the propaganda had suggested. When they reached Yamamoto, the guard gestured to his pocket. "Empty it." Yamamoto's heart hammered. He pulled out the wrapped cloth and held it in his palm. The guard unwrapped it, looked at the tiny Buddha. Yamamoto waited for him to throw it away, to crush it under his boot, to laugh. The guard studied it for a long moment. He was young, maybe 20, with red hair and freckles across his nose. He turned the figure over in his hand, examining the careful carving, the serene expression on the Buddha's face. Then he looked at Yamamoto. Their eyes met. The guard wrapped it back up and handed it to Yamamoto. "Keep it," the interpreter said. The guard moved on to the next man. That small moment rippled through the prisoners like electricity. They'd been allowed to keep their faith objects, strings of prayer beads, small sutras written on paper, miniature shrine items. One by one, the guards examined them and returned them. It was the first hint that something different might be happening here, but the prisoners remained wary. Trust was not something you gave easily, especially not to your captors. They'd been trained to expect the worst. The military code they'd been raised with said that surrender was the ultimate shame, that prisoners would be treated with contempt because they deserved contempt. Yet here they were, being processed with something that resembled respect. The cognitive dissonance was almost painful. That first night in the barracks, Yamamoto lay on his bunk and listened to the men around him. Some wept quietly. Others stared at the ceiling in silence. A few whispered prayers. One man, a private named Sato from Hokkaido, kept repeating the same thing. "We should have died. We should have died." Yamamoto understood. They'd survived when honor demanded death. Now they had to figure out how to live with that. The camp commandant was Colonel James Morrison, a career officer from Virginia who'd spent 2 years in Japan before the war studying military strategy. He spoke conversational Japanese. He'd visited Buddhist temples in Kyoto and Nara. He'd sat with monks and learned about their traditions. When he was assigned to Angel Island, he made a decision that would define his legacy. He would follow the Geneva Convention to the letter. And the Geneva Convention was clear. Prisoners had the right to practice their religion. Morrison's background was unusual for an American officer in 1943. He'd been part of a military exchange program in the late 1930s, sent to observe the Imperial Japanese Army and report back on their tactics and organization. He'd arrived in Tokyo in 1937, just as Japan's war with China was escalating, and spent 18 months embedded with various units. But his most profound experiences had come during his off-duty hours. A Japanese colleague, a captain named Ishida, had invited Morrison to his family home in Kyoto for New Year's celebrations. There, Morrison had experienced Japanese culture at its most traditional. He'd watched the family visit their ancestral temple, had observed the meticulous rituals, had felt the deep reverence that permeated every gesture. Ishida's elderly father, a retired general, had explained Buddhism to Morrison in careful, formal English. The old man had said, "In the West, you separate the sacred and the secular. You go to church on Sunday and live your normal life the rest of the week. For us, it is different. Every action can be sacred. Every moment can be practice. The tea ceremony, the flower arrangement, the way we greet each other. These are all expressions of Buddhist principles. To remove our faith would be to remove our identity. Morrison had never forgotten that conversation. Now, looking at the frightened men in his charge, he remembered the general's words. These weren't just enemy soldiers. They were human beings whose faith was woven into the fabric of their existence. To deny them that faith would be to deny their humanity. And Morrison believed, perhaps naively in the context of total war, that even enemies deserved to be treated as human. His approach wasn't universally popular among his staff. His executive officer, a Major Brennan from Boston, had argued during their first meeting that the prisoners should have minimal privileges. "They're Japs, sir," Brennan had said, using the slur casually. "They tried to kill us. Why should we give them anything beyond basic necessities?" Morrison had responded quietly but firmly. "Because we're not them. Because we're fighting this war to defend certain principles. And if we abandon those principles, we've already lost. The Geneva Convention isn't a suggestion. It's a legal obligation. And it explicitly protects religious practice. We will honor that. Is that clear?" Brennan had saluted stiffly. "Yes, sir." But Morrison knew the major remained unconvinced. This was going to be an ongoing battle, not just with the prisoners, but with his own command structure. The first test came 3 weeks after the prisoners arrived. It was November, and several of the men approached the interpreter with a request. They wanted to hold a memorial service for fallen comrades. A proper Buddhist ceremony to honor the dead. They expected rejection. Instead, the request made its way to Morrison's desk. He approved it within an hour. The decision sparked immediate controversy. Brennan argued it was a security risk. Large gatherings could lead to coordinated resistance. The camp chaplain, a Protestant minister named Reverend Walsh, worried it would look like the Americans were endorsing a heathen religion. Even some of the guards expressed discomfort. They'd lost buddies in the Pacific. Honoring enemy dead felt wrong. Morrison called a meeting of his senior staff. He laid out his reasoning methodically. First, the Geneva Convention. Second, the practical benefit. Allowing religious practice would improve morale and reduce tensions, making the camp easier to manage. Third, the moral argument. We're supposed to be better than them. That means treating them better than they treat us. Walsh, the chaplain, raised his hand. "Sir, I respect your position, but don't you think there's a difference between allowing them to pray privately and actively facilitating their ceremonies? Approving an organized service feels like endorsement." Morrison shook his head. "Reverend, do we endorse Christianity when we provide you with a chapel and let our men attend services? Or are we simply recognizing that faith matters to people? I'm not asking you to convert to Buddhism. I'm asking you to respect that these men believe something different, and they have a legal right to practice it." The room fell silent. Finally, Brennan spoke. "Sir, if we do this, the press might get wind of it. There could be hell to pay from the public. Americans who lost sons in the Pacific aren't going to understand why we're letting Japs hold religious ceremonies." "I know," Morrison said, "but I'd rather answer to the public for doing what's right than answer to my conscience for doing what's popular. The ceremony is approved. We'll hold it Sunday in the Assembly Hall. I want guards posted, but they're there to protect the ceremony, not disrupt it. Make sure every man understands that." The ceremony was scheduled for Sunday morning in the camp's assembly hall. The prisoners spent 2 days preparing. They fashioned an altar from wooden crates, arranged their small Buddha figures in a line, created offerings from whatever they could find. Cups of water, a few flowers picked. From the grounds, folded paper cranes. They had no incense, so they burned small pieces of cedar wood that gave off a fragrant smoke. The preparations themselves became a form of meditation. The men worked in near silence, each gesture deliberate and careful. Yamamoto helped construct the altar, using carpentry skills his father had taught him years ago. As he planed the wood smooth, he found himself thinking about his village, about the temple where his grandmother still prayed, about a life that felt impossibly distant. A prisoner named Nakamura, who'd been a schoolteacher before the war, spent hours folding paper cranes. His hands moved with practiced precision, turning plain white paper into delicate birds. In Japanese tradition, the crane represented longevity and good fortune, but Nakamura was folding them for men who'd never grow old, for comrades whose fortune had run out. The symbolism was bittersweet, but it felt important. The dead deserved beauty. When Sunday came, 80 men gathered in the hall. They wore their prison uniforms, but they'd cleaned them carefully, pressed them as best they could. This was sacred time. Yamamoto stood near the altar, his grandmother's Buddha placed in the center. A former monk named Hayashi led the chanting. His voice rose and fell in the ancient rhythms of the Heart Sutra, and for a few moments, the men weren't prisoners. They were connected to something that transcended the war, the ocean, the barbed wire surrounding them. Hayashi was 45 years old, older than most of the prisoners. He'd been a monk at a temple in Wakayama before being conscripted in 1942. The military had taken him despite his religious vocation by that point in the war. Japan needed every able-bodied man. He'd served as a medic, trying to square his vow to not take life with the brutal realities of combat. When he was captured, part of him felt relief. He could finally return to what he was meant to be. Now, leading the chanting, he felt a kind of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The words of the Heart Sutra were so familiar they seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Suffering exists, but so does the path beyond suffering. The men chanted with him, their voices blending into a single sound that filled the wooden hall. Outside, Morrison had posted guards. Not to watch the prisoners, but to ensure no one disturbed them. When a supply truck arrived mid-ceremony, a guard stopped it at the gate and made it wait until the chanting finished. When an officer new to the camp tried to enter the hall, another guard quietly blocked his path and whispered that a religious service was underway. The officer, confused, asked why they were allowing this. The guard said, "Colonel's orders, sir." The new officer was Lieutenant Davis, fresh from training and assigned to Angel Island as his first post. He'd expected a hardship posting, a place where brutal enemies were kept in brutal conditions. Instead, he found guards protecting Buddhist prayers. He later admitted to Morrison that it shattered every assumption he'd brought with him. "I thought we were supposed to break them, sir," he said. Morrison replied, "We're supposed to contain them. There's a difference." After the ceremony ended, the men filed out in silence. Several had tears on their faces. Hayashi, the monk, approached Morrison through an interpreter. He bowed deeply. He said he'd expected to die never practicing his faith again, that he'd prepared himself to lose that part of his soul, that what Morrison had done was a kindness beyond measure. Morrison's response was simple. "It's not kindness. It's law. The Geneva Convention requires it." But there was something in his voice, the interpreter later said, that suggested it was more than legal obligation. It was rhetoric. The interpreter, a Nisei man named George Takahashi, found himself in a unique position. He'd been born in Sacramento to Japanese immigrant parents, had grown up American in every way that mattered, but looked Japanese enough that after Pearl Harbor, his family had been sent to an internment camp. He'd volunteered for military service to prove his loyalty, and now he was translating between American officers and Japanese prisoners, caught between worlds in the most literal sense. Takahashi noticed something in Morrison's eyes when Hayashi thanked him. It wasn't pity. It wasn't superiority. It was genuine respect. The kind you showed to someone whose beliefs you might not share, but whose humanity you recognize completely. Takahashi had seen the opposite often enough. Officers who viewed every Japanese person, enemy or ally, with contempt. Morrison was different. After translating the exchange, Takahashi added his own observation. "Sir, I don't think you understand what you've done here. For these men, Buddhism isn't like Sunday church. It's their entire worldview. By protecting it, you've told them they still have dignity. That's not something they expected." Morrison nodded slowly. "I spent time in Japan before the war," he said. "I learned enough to know that faith matters. Beyond that, I'm just following the rules. But thank you for explaining it. I need you to help me understand them, George. You're the bridge. Don't underestimate how important that makes you." Word of the ceremony spread through the prisoner of war system like wildfire. Japanese soldiers held in camps across the American West heard about Angel Island, about the American colonel who protected Buddhist practices, about the guards who stood watch so ceremonies wouldn't be disturbed, for men who'd been taught that Americans were demons, who'd been told that surrender meant torture and death. This news was incomprehensible. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, prisoners refused to believe it. They thought it was propaganda, a lie designed to break their spirits. At Camp Clarinda in Iowa, men assumed it was an isolated incident, one compassionate officer acting against policy. But as more prisoners were transferred between camps, as more first-hand accounts emerged, the truth became undeniable. The Americans were honoring religious freedom, even for their enemies. A prisoner named Lieutenant Ito, transferred from Angel Island to McCoy in December 1943, found himself surrounded by skeptical comrades demanding to know if the stories were true. Had they really been allowed to build altars? Had guards really protected ceremonies? Had an American colonel really approved it all? Ito confirmed every detail. He described the Sunday services, the sound of Hayashi's chanting, the way guards had stood respectfully outside. He showed them a small sutra he'd been allowed to keep, proof that the Americans weren't confiscating religious materials. The men at McCoy listened in stunned silence. One prisoner, a sergeant named Kimura, said, "This makes no sense. We were taught Americans have no honor, that they're barbarians. But what you describe is honorable. How do we reconcile this?" Ito had no answer. He'd been struggling with the same question for weeks. The America he'd experienced at Angel Island bore no resemblance to the America described in Japanese propaganda. It created a crack in his certainty, a doubt that spread through everything he'd been taught. If they'd lied about how Americans treated prisoners, what else had they lied about? By early 1944, Angel Island had established regular Buddhist services every Sunday. The prisoners had built a proper altar with wood donated by the camp carpenter. They'd painted prayers on cloth strips and hung them from the ceiling. Morrison had even approved the acquisition of a small bell, the kind used in Buddhist temples to mark the beginning and end of meditation. When it rang, its clear tone carried across the camp, and men in the barracks would pause whatever they were doing and offer silent prayers. The bell had an interesting origin story. Morrison had mentioned in passing to Chaplain Walsh that the prisoners needed a proper bell for their ceremonies. Walsh, despite his initial reservations about Buddhist practices, had taken it upon himself to find one. He'd contacted religious supply companies, explaining what he needed and why. Most had refused. Selling religious items to Japanese prisoners felt unpatriotic. But Walsh persisted. Finally, he found a small Buddhist temple in San Francisco's Japantown, which had been largely emptied when its congregation was sent to internment camps. The temple's elderly caretaker, one of the few allowed to remain, listened to Walsh's request. "You want a bell for Japanese prisoners?" he asked. "Yes," Walsh said, "because they deserve to practice their faith." The caretaker was silent for a long moment, then said, "Wait here." He returned with a bell that had belonged to the temple for 30 years. "Take it," he said. "Those men are prisoners, but they're still Buddhist. If this bell can bring them peace, then that's what it should do." Walsh tried to pay, but the caretaker refused. "Just tell them someone remembered them," he said. When Walsh presented the bell to Morrison, he said, "Sir, I want you to know I did this because you were right. Faith matters, even when it's not our faith." Morrison accepted the bell with gratitude, and it was installed at the altar that same week. The guards grew accustomed to the rituals. Some developed genuine curiosity. A young private from Kansas named Henry Brooks asked Yamamoto, through an interpreter, what the chanting meant. Yamamoto explained that it was about understanding suffering, about finding compassion, even in darkness. Brooks nodded slowly. "My mother's Methodist," he said. "She talks about loving your enemies." Guess maybe you folks got something similar. That conversation, small as it was, represented something profound. These men were supposed to hate each other. They'd been locked in total war, a conflict defined by racial hatred and brutal violence. Yet here, in a prison camp on an island in San Francisco Bay, they were finding common ground in faith. Brooks became one of the regular guards assigned to the Sunday ceremonies. At first, it was just duty. He stood outside and made sure no one interrupted. But gradually he found himself listening. He didn't understand the words, but he recognized the tone, the reverence, the sincerity. It reminded him of church back home, of his mother's voice singing hymns, of the feeling that something larger than yourself was present in the moment. One Sunday, after a particularly moving ceremony, Brooks approached Yamamoto. Through Takahashi's translation, he asked, "Do you believe in God?" Yamamoto thought carefully before answering. "We don't have one God like you do," he said, "but we believe in enlightenment, in understanding the nature of suffering and finding compassion." Maybe that's another way of talking about the same thing. Brooks considered this. "So when you pray, who are you praying to?" Yamamoto smiled. "We're not praying to someone. We're practicing being present, being aware, finding the stillness inside ourselves. Buddha isn't a god to worship. He's a teacher who showed us the path." This fascinated Brooks. Back home, prayer had always been about asking God for things, for help or forgiveness or guidance. The idea that you could pray without asking, that meditation could be its own goal, was foreign but intriguing. He started reading about Buddhism in the camp library, trying to understand these men whose faith was so different from his own, yet somehow familiar. Not everyone supported Morrison's approach. Some officers in the military hierarchy viewed it as coddling the enemy. After an inspection in March 1944, a visiting general pulled Morrison aside and questioned whether allowing Buddhist ceremonies sent the wrong message, whether it might make the prisoners think Americans were soft. Morrison's response was measured but firm. "We're not soft. We're lawful. There's a difference." The general, a crusty veteran named McAllister, who'd fought in World War I, wasn't satisfied. He'd spent the day touring the camp and had been disturbed by what he saw. The prisoners looked healthy, well-fed. The barracks were clean. The recreation yard had volleyball equipment. And now he'd learned about religious ceremonies being actively protected. "General," Morrison said, "I understand your concern, but consider what we're accomplishing here. We have 150 prisoners who could be causing constant trouble, fights, escape attempts, sabotage. Instead, they're cooperative, disciplined. They work in the camp kitchen and laundry without incident. They follow orders. And a large part of that is because we're treating them with basic human dignity." McAllister frowned. "You think coddling makes them cooperative? Fear makes men cooperative." "No, sir," Morrison said. Fear makes men desperate. Desperate men do desperate things. Respect makes men cooperative. These prisoners know they're being treated far better than they would be in Japanese camps. That creates a debt, a moral obligation. They don't want to violate our trust because we've shown them trust. It's more effective than any punishment could be. The general wasn't convinced, but Morrison had the Geneva Convention on his side. The International Red Cross had inspected Angel Island twice and found it in full compliance. The prisoners were fed adequately, housed properly, and allowed religious expression. By every legal measure, Morrison was beyond reproach. Still, he knew he was walking a fine line. One incident, one perceived lapse in security or discipline, and his approach could be dismantled. That incident nearly came in July 1944. A prisoner named Saito, a fierce nationalist who'd resisted the surrender even after his unit was overrun, began organizing resistance within the camp. He argued that true soldiers should refuse to cooperate with captors, that accepting American kindness was betraying the emperor, that Buddhist ceremonies held with enemy permission were spiritually contaminated. Saito had been a problem from the beginning. He was a lieutenant, one of the highest-ranking prisoners at Angel Island, and he'd never accepted his capture. In his mind, he should have died in combat. Every day he lived as a prisoner was another day of shame. He channeled that shame into anger, and he used his rank to influence younger prisoners. His argument was seductive in its simplicity. Real soldiers don't accept charity from enemies. The Americans are trying to break us with kindness. They want us to forget who we are, to become soft, to abandon our loyalty to the emperor. We must resist. We must refuse their gifts, reject their offerings, maintain our purity through defiance. Saito had followers. About 20 men who agreed that cooperation meant dishonor. They refused to attend the Sunday services. They harassed prisoners who did, calling them traitors and weaklings. The tension in the camp escalated daily. Yamamoto found himself confronted one evening by two of Saito's followers. "You disgrace us," one said, "praying with American permission. Your grandmother would be ashamed." Yamamoto felt anger flash through him. But he thought of Hayashi's teachings. Anger is like fire. You cannot eliminate it, but you can choose not to feed it. He said quietly, "My grandmother gave me this Buddha so I would remember who I am. If I stop praying because I'm a prisoner, then I've let them take something more important than my freedom. I've let them take my soul." The confrontation escalated. One of Saito's followers shoved Yamamoto. Others intervened. Guards rushed in to break up the fight before it turned violent. But the incident made clear that Saito's influence was growing, and something had to be done. The crisis came one night in late July. Saito and his followers staged a raid on the assembly hall. They destroyed part of the altar, breaking the bell that Chaplain Walsh had acquired, scattering the Buddha figures across the floor, tearing down the prayer cloth. When Yamamoto and others arrived for morning prayers, they found the devastation and wept. The bell was in pieces. The beautiful altar that had taken weeks to build was smashed. The prayer cloths were torn and trampled. It felt like more than vandalism. It felt like a violation of something sacred. Yamamoto knelt among the debris, picking up the fragments of his grandmother's Buddha. And for a moment, he felt despair deeper than anything he'd experienced in combat. Hayashi stood in the doorway, surveying the destruction. His face was calm, but those who knew him could see the pain in his eyes. He said quietly, "Suffering exists, but so does the path beyond suffering. We will rebuild." Morrison had a choice. He could crack down on all the prisoners, cancel the ceremonies, tighten restrictions. That would satisfy his critics and eliminate the problem. Or he could treat this as what it was, a small group of extremists disrupting the peaceful practices of the majority. He chose the latter. His decision was strategic, but also principled. He met with his staff and laid out the plan. Saito and his core followers would be separated from the general population. They'd be placed in a different barracks, with restricted privileges but still treated according to Geneva Convention standards. The Buddhist services would continue. The altar would be rebuilt. The message would be clear. Faith would be protected, even from those who claimed it made them weak. Brennan, the executive officer, argued for harsher punishment. Sir, this was destruction of government property. This was organized resistance. We should make an example of them. Court-martial, solitary confinement, bread and water. Morrison shook his head. If we overreact, we prove Saito's point. He wants to paint us as oppressors. If we cancel the ceremonies, he wins. If we brutalize him, he becomes a martyr. No. We separate the troublemakers, we protect the majority, and we show everyone that our commitment to religious freedom is stronger than one man's hatred. The plan was executed within 24 hours. Saito and his 18 followers were moved to a separate barracks. They lost recreation privileges, their mail was more heavily censored, and they were assigned less desirable work details, but they were still fed properly, still housed adequately, still treated as prisoners of war with rights. Meanwhile, the main camp mobilized to rebuild. Morrison personally approved funds for materials. The camp carpenter worked overtime. Chaplain Walsh contacted the temple in Japantown again. And the elderly caretaker provided another bell, smaller than the first, but just as beautiful. Within a week, the altar was rebuilt. Yamamoto found his grandmother's Buddha among the scattered figures, miraculously undamaged. A tiny wooden miracle that felt like a sign. And that Sunday, 90 men attended the ceremony, more than had come before Saito's attack. They came in defiance of intimidation. They came to prove that faith mattered more than politics. They came because Morrison had shown them that their beliefs were worth protecting, even at the cost of additional conflict. The message was clear. Faith would be protected, even from those who claimed it made them weak. By late 1944, the war in the Pacific was turning decisively in America's favor. More prisoners arrived at Angel Island, men captured in the Philippines, in the Marianas, in New Guinea. They came expecting the worst and found something they couldn't reconcile with their understanding of the enemy. One prisoner, a lieutenant named Oda, later wrote in his diary, "I was prepared to die with honor. Instead, I found Americans who guarded my prayers. How do I understand this? How do I return to Japan and explain it?" Oda had been captured on Saipan after a brutal 3-week siege. He'd watched his unit disintegrate, had seen the suicidal banzai charges that accomplished nothing except adding to the body count. When the Americans finally overran their position, Oda had been wounded and unconscious. He woke in an American field hospital, and his first thought was shame. He'd failed to die. The journey to Angel Island took weeks. Other prisoners told him about the camp, about the Buddhist ceremonies, about the colonel who protected them. Oda thought they were describing a fantasy, a coping mechanism to deal with captivity. It couldn't be real. When he arrived and witnessed his first Sunday service, he stood in the back of the hall, tears streaming down his face. Everything he'd been taught was wrong. The Americans weren't demons. They weren't trying to destroy Japanese culture. They were respecting it. The cognitive dissonance was so profound he felt physically ill. After the service, he approached Hayashi. "How is this possible?" he asked. "How can our enemies honor our faith?" Hayashi smiled gently. "Perhaps they are not our enemies. Perhaps they are men, like us, trying to do what's right in an impossible situation. Perhaps war makes enemies of people who would otherwise be friends. That confusion, that cognitive dissonance, became a crack in the wall of hatred. The prisoners at Angel Island weren't being brainwashed or converted. They were simply being allowed to be human, to practice their faith, to mourn their dead, to find moments of peace in captivity. And for many, that was more powerful than any propaganda. The camp's Sunday services evolved into something remarkable. Hayashi, the monk, began offering teachings in addition to memorial ceremonies. He spoke about the Four Noble Truths, about the nature of suffering, about the path to understanding. Some guards, standing watch outside, began asking interpreters what was being said. A few requested permission to observe. Morrison allowed it, provided they showed respect. Remove your hats, remain silent, don't interrupt. Private Brooks became a regular observer. He'd stand at the back of the hall, watching the prisoners kneel and chant, fascinated by the ritual. The way they moved in unison, the way their voices blended, the complete focus in their faces. He'd never seen anything quite like it, even in the most passionate church services back home. One day, he asked Hayashi, through the interpreter, whether anger could ever be overcome completely. Hayashi smiled. He said, "Anger is like fire. You cannot eliminate fire from the world, but you can choose not to feed it. You can let it burn out naturally, and you can learn to use its heat without letting it consume you." Brooks thought about that for days. He'd lost friends in the Pacific. His best buddy from basic training, a kid from Oklahoma named Jimmy, had died on Guadalcanal. Brooks had been furious when he learned he'd be guarding Japanese prisoners. Part of him had wanted revenge, had wanted to see them suffer. But working at Angel Island changed something. These weren't the faceless enemy of propaganda. They were individual men with names and stories and beliefs. They prayed to different gods, but they prayed with the same sincerity. They mourned their dead with the same grief. They hoped for home with the same longing. One evening, Brooks wrote a letter to Jimmy's mother. He told her about Angel Island, about the Buddhist ceremonies, about learning that enemies could be human. He wrote, "I think Jimmy would understand this. He always said the war was against their government, not their souls." I'm starting to see what he meant. As 1945 dawned, everyone knew the war was nearing its end. American forces were closing in on Japan's home islands. The prisoners at Angel Island heard rumors of massive bombing campaigns, of cities in ruins. Some prayed for their families. Others sat in silent meditation, preparing themselves for whatever came next. The Sunday ceremonies took on new weight. They were no longer just about remembering the past. They were about finding strength for an uncertain future. The bombing campaigns were devastating. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya. Entire cities reduced to ash. The prisoners received limited news, but enough filtered through to paint a picture of apocalyptic destruction. Yamamoto's village was in Kyoto, which so far had been spared, but he didn't know if his grandmother was still alive. The uncertainty was torture. During one Sunday service, Hayashi spoke about impermanence. "Sana, all things pass," he said. "Joy and suffering, victory and defeat, war and peace. Nothing lasts forever. This can bring despair if we cling to what we're losing, or it can bring freedom if we accept change as the nature of existence. Right now, Japan is changing. Your families are suffering. But they will survive, as we have survived. Because life persists. Because the human spirit is stronger than bombs." The men listened with desperate attention. They needed to believe their families would survive. They needed to believe that something of Japan would remain when the war ended. Hayashi's words offered a framework for hope that didn't require denying reality. In April, news reached the camp of President Roosevelt's death. Morrison gathered the prisoners and, through interpreters, informed them. He said that even in war, the loss of a nation's leader was a solemn moment. That evening, several prisoners approached him with a request. Could they hold a ceremony to honor the deceased, even though he'd been their enemy? Morrison, surprised, agreed. The ceremony was small, just a dozen men. But they lit candles, offered prayers, and acknowledged that Roosevelt's death was a human tragedy regardless of politics. Yamamoto participated. thinking about what his grandmother had taught him. All life is connected, all suffering is shared. Roosevelt had been his enemy, but he'd also been someone's father, someone's husband, someone's friend. His death diminished the world. When word of this reached the press, it caused a sensation. American newspapers ran headlines. Japanese POWs honor FDR. Some praised it as a sign of the prisoner's humanity. Others condemned it as misplaced sympathy. Radio commentators debated whether it was appropriate. Letters poured into military headquarters, some supporting Morrison's approach, others demanding his removal. Morrison said nothing publicly, but privately he felt vindicated. This was what happened when you treated people with dignity. They responded with grace. They recognized shared humanity even across the boundaries of war. They proved that honor and compassion could survive in the darkest circumstances. A letter arrived at Morrison's office from a woman in Maine, Minsk, whose son had died on Iwo Jima. She'd read about the ceremony for Roosevelt and wanted Morrison to know that she supported him. "If those Japanese prisoners can honor our president," she wrote, "then maybe there's hope that this hatred can end someday. Maybe my son didn't die for nothing. Maybe we can build a world where enemies remember they're human." Morrison kept that letter in his desk drawer for the rest of his life. By August, the war was over. The atomic bombs had fallen. Japan had surrendered. At Angel Island, the prisoners received the news in stunned silence. Some felt relief. Others felt shame that they'd survived when their country had been defeated. The Buddhist services that week were packed. Over 120 men gathering to process their emotions, to pray for their shattered nation, to seek some understanding of what the future held. The reality of nuclear weapons was almost impossible to comprehend. Entire cities vaporized in seconds. Tens of thousands dead instantly, more dying from radiation. The prisoners struggled to understand how such destruction was possible, how the war had escalated to weapons that seemed to end the world itself. Hayashi led a special ceremony focused on the concept of metta, loving kindness meditation. He guided the men through prayers extending compassion to all beings. To their families suffering in Japan, to the American soldiers who'd fought them, to the victims of the atomic bombs, to the leaders on both sides who'd made impossible choices. He said, "This is the hardest practice, to extend compassion to everyone, even those who've caused suffering. But this is when it matters most. When hatred is easiest, compassion becomes most necessary." Some men couldn't do it. The destruction was too raw, the pain too fresh. But others found in Hayashi's words a path forward, a way to process the horror without drowning in bitterness. Morrison knew that soon the prisoners would be repatriated, sent back to a Japan they wouldn't recognize, occupied by the forces that had captured them. Before they left, he wanted to do something. He approached Hayashi and, through an interpreter, asked if the prisoners would like to hold one final ceremony, a large gathering to mark the end of their time at Angel Island. The ceremony took place in September in the camp's main yard. Every prisoner attended, even some of Saito's group who'd resisted the ceremonies for months. They'd constructed an elaborate altar, the most beautiful they'd created, decorated with paper cranes and calligraphy scrolls. Hayashi led the chanting, his voice strong and clear in the late summer air. The guards stood at attention around the perimeter, heads bowed in respect. Morrison himself attended, standing at the back, witnessing what his decision 22 months earlier had enabled. The chanting lasted nearly an hour. The Heart Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, prayers for the dead, prayers for the living, prayers for a world learning to be peaceful again. When it ended, silence fell over the yard. No one moved. The moment felt too important to break with ordinary action. Finally, Hayashi spoke. He thanked Morrison and the guards. He acknowledged the Geneva Convention, but said what had happened at Angel Island went beyond legal compliance. You could have followed the rules with cold efficiency, he said through Takahashi. Instead, you showed us warmth. You could have allowed ceremonies while making clear you disapproved. Instead, you protected them with genuine respect. That gift will live in our memories forever. When the ceremony ended, Yamamoto approached Morrison. He held out his grandmother's Buddha, the tiny wooden figure that had survived battles and captivity. He wanted Morrison to have it as thanks. Morrison shook his head gently. "Keep it," he said through the interpreter. "Take it home. Remember that even in war, faith survived." Yamamoto bowed deeply, tears streaming down his face, and returned the Buddha to his pocket. One by one, other prisoners approached Morrison. Some bowed, some shook his hand, an awkward gesture they'd learned from the Americans. Some simply looked at him, trying to convey gratitude that exceeded their ability to express it. Morrison accepted each gesture with quiet dignity, moved by emotions he couldn't quite name. That evening, Morrison wrote in his private journal, "Today, I watched 150 men pray their way toward peace. They're going home to destruction, to occupation, to uncertainty. But they're not going home broken. They're going home with their faith intact, with their dignity preserved. I don't know if that matters in the grand scheme of the war, but it matters to them, and maybe that's enough." The repatriation began in October 1945. The prisoners were loaded onto ships and sent back across the Pacific, back to a Japan devastated by firebombing and occupation. Many carried with them the prayer beads, the small sutras, the faith objects they'd been allowed to keep. But more than that, they carried a memory of an American colonel who'd protected their prayers, of guards who'd stood watch over Buddhist ceremonies, of a time when enemies had shown each other dignity. The journey home was surreal. The same ocean they'd crossed as soldiers, now crossing as returning prisoners. Japan was under American occupation, MacArthur's administration running the country. The prisoners didn't know what to expect. Would they be punished for surrendering, welcomed as survivors, shunned as failures? When Yamamoto's ship docked in Yokohama, he barely recognized the port. Entire sections had been bombed flat. The city looked skeletal, haunted. He made his way by train to Kyoto, which had been spared the worst of the bombing, and walked the familiar streets to his grandmother's house. She was alive. Thin, aged beyond her years, but alive. When she opened the door and saw him, she collapsed into his arms, sobbing. He pulled out the wooden Buddha she'd given him and placed it in her palm. "I kept it safe," he said. "Just like you told me. It kept me centered, even in darkness." His grandmother held the Buddha and wept. Then she said, "The war took so much from us, but it didn't take everything. You came home with your soul intact. That's all I prayed for." In the decades that followed, several of the Angel Island prisoners wrote about their experiences. Yamamoto returned to his village outside Kyoto and became a lay Buddhist teacher. He often told his students about the camp, about the American commander who'd honored the Geneva Convention when he didn't have to, about the guards who'd learned to respect practices they didn't understand, about the way faith could survive even in captivity, if someone chose to protect it. He taught for 40 years, and every class included the Angel Island story. He described the moment when the guard handed back his Buddha, when Colonel Morrison approved the first ceremony, when Private Brooks asked about the meaning of the chants, and he'd tell students, "War teaches us to hate, but sometimes, if we're lucky, we meet people who teach us something else, who show us that our enemies are human, who protect what's sacred even when they don't have to. Those people change history, not through great battles, but through small acts of respect." Hayashi, the monk, returned to his temple in Nagano. He wrote a memoir in the 1960s that included a chapter on Angel Island. In it, he reflected on the paradox of finding spiritual freedom in a prison camp, of practicing Buddhism more authentically behind barbed wire than he'd sometimes managed in civilian life. He wrote, "Colonel Morrison taught me that the law can be an instrument of compassion, that rules, when followed with respect for human dignity, can protect the sacred." I went to that camp as a prisoner and left as a student. I learned that faith doesn't require freedom, it requires protection. And sometimes that protection comes from the most unexpected sources. The Americans guarded my body because the Geneva Convention demanded it. But Morrison guarded my soul because his conscience demanded it. That's the difference between compliance and compassion. The memoir became required reading in several Japanese Buddhist monasteries, used to teach monks about maintaining faith under adversity. Morrison himself never sought attention for what he'd done. After the war, he retired from the military and moved back to Virginia. He rarely spoke about Angel Island. When asked once by a local newspaper about his approach to prisoner management, he said simply, "I followed the regulations. The Geneva Convention was clear. Prisoners had rights. I enforced those rights. That's all." But it wasn't all. Because enforcing those rights in the middle of a brutal, racially charged war required courage. It required believing that the law mattered even when applied to enemies. It required seeing beyond uniforms and national allegiances to the shared humanity beneath. Morrison could have found excuses to deny the Buddhist ceremonies. He could have cited security concerns, cultural differences, the anger of Americans who'd lost loved ones in the Pacific. Instead, he chose the harder path, to uphold principles even when they protected people his country was fighting to destroy. His wife, Eleanor, understood better than most what it had cost him. The tension with his superiors, the criticism from peers who thought he was too soft, the hate mail from Americans who'd lost family members in the Pacific. Morrison bore it all quietly, never defending himself publicly, trusting that history would judge his actions fairly. One evening in 1952, years after the war, Eleanor found Morrison sitting in his study, holding a letter. It was from Yamamoto, written in careful English with help from a translator. It thanked Morrison again for protecting the Buddhist ceremonies and included a photograph of Yamamoto teaching students at his temple. Morrison stared at the photo for a long time. Eleanor asked what he was thinking. He said, "I wonder if I made a difference, if any of it mattered." She took his hand and said, "You made a difference to them. Sometimes that's all we can do. Make a difference to the people in front of us. That has to be enough." The story of Angel Island's Buddhist ceremonies remained largely unknown for decades. It didn't fit neat narratives about World War II. It complicated the story of unwavering hatred between Americans and Japanese. It suggested that even in total war, spaces for dignity and respect could be carved out, that compassion wasn't weakness, that protecting enemy prisoners' faith didn't mean abandoning your own values. It meant living up to them. Military historians occasionally referenced Angel Island in studies of POW treatment, usually as a footnote demonstrating Geneva Convention compliance. But the emotional and spiritual significance of what happened there was rarely explored. It was easier to focus on dramatic escapes, brutal prison camps, clear-cut stories of heroism and villainy. Angel Island was subtle, complex. It didn't fit templates, but for those who'd been there, for the prisoners and guards whose lives intersected on that island, it was the defining experience of the war. Brooks returned to Kansas after his discharge and worked his family's farm. He never spoke much about his military service, but he kept a photo of the Buddhist bell in his wallet until he died. His children found it after his death and wondered what it meant. Why would their father carry a picture of a Japanese temple bell? In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, several former Angel Island prisoners returned to San Francisco for a remembrance ceremony. Yamamoto was among them, now 76 years old. He brought his grandmother's Buddha, still wrapped in the same oiled cloth. He visited the island, now a state park, and stood where the camp's assembly hall had been. The buildings were long gone, but the ground remembered. A Japanese television crew was filming the visit. They asked Yamamoto what he felt, returning to the place where he'd been imprisoned. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "This island was where I learned that my enemies could be more faithful to my religion than I sometimes was. That an American colonel understood the importance of protecting what was sacred. That even in the darkest times, some people choose light. I was a prisoner here, yes, but I was also free to be who I was. That's a gift I've never forgotten." The interviewer pressed, "But weren't you angry? Being held captive by the people who defeated your country?" Yamamoto shook his head. "Anger would have been easy. Anger would have been understandable. But Colonel Morrison didn't give me reason for anger. He gave me reason for gratitude. And gratitude is harder than anger, but more powerful. It changes you in ways anger never can." Morrison had died in 1983, but his daughter attended the ceremony. She'd brought some of her father's papers, including his daily logs from Angel Island. In them, he'd written occasional reflections on the Buddhist services. One entry from December 1944 read, "Attended the prisoners' ceremony today. Watched them chant in a language I don't understand, to a faith I don't share, for soldiers who tried to kill Americans. And yet I felt I was witnessing something important, something that justified why we're fighting this war. Not to destroy our enemy's humanity, but to defend the principle that all people deserve dignity, even when they're behind wire, even when they're on the wrong side. Especially then." Morrison's daughter, reading this aloud to the assembled crowd, broke down in tears. She'd known her father was a good man, a principled officer, but she hadn't fully understood the weight of what he'd done until this moment. Standing among the men whose faith he'd protected, hearing their gratitude 5 decades later, the former prisoners presented Morrison's daughter with a gift, a Buddhist prayer bell inscribed with English and Japanese characters. It read, "In memory of Colonel James Morrison, who guarded not just prisoners, but their souls, with eternal gratitude." She accepted it with tears, understanding perhaps for the first time the full scope of what her father had done. That bell now sits in a military museum in Virginia, a quiet testament to an extraordinary moment. Visitors often walk past it without noticing. It's small, unadorned, easy to miss among more dramatic artifacts. But those who stop and read the inscription encounter something powerful. Evidence that even in humanity's darkest hours, some people choose to be better than they have to be. The Angel Island story eventually reached academic circles. Historians studying prisoner of war experiences found it remarkable, an outlier in a system that often struggled with basic humane treatment. Some argued it showed what was possible when commanders took international law seriously. Others suggested it was precisely because Morrison had studied Japanese culture that he understood what protecting Buddhist practices meant to the prisoners. That knowledge, that respect for the enemy's culture, had translated into policy. Professor Margaret Chen, teaching a course on Pacific War history at Berkeley, assigned Hayashi's memoir to her students. One student, a young man whose grandfather had fought in the Pacific, came to her office hours troubled. "My grandfather talked about the Japanese as monsters," he said. "He saw what they did to prisoners, the brutality. How do I reconcile that with this story? Were there good guys and bad guys? Or was it more complicated?" Chen thought carefully before answering. "War brings out the worst in humanity," she said. "But it can also reveal the best. Your grandfather's experiences were real. The brutality was real. But so was Angel Island. So was Morrison. History isn't simple. The same war that produced unthinkable cruelty also produced moments of grace. Both things can be true. But maybe the simplest explanation was the truest one. Morrison believed that people deserved to practice their faith. that this wasn't a privilege to be granted or denied based on whether they were friend or enemy. It was a fundamental human right, enshrined in the convention since his country had signed. And he was willing to enforce it, even when it would have been easier not to. He once wrote to his wife, "The easy path would be to deny them ceremonies, to claim security concerns, to say the law is unclear. No one would blame me, but I'd blame myself, because I know what's right, and knowing what's right means nothing if you don't do it, especially when it's hard." That philosophy extended beyond religious freedom. Morrison ran Angel Island with consistent respect for human dignity. Prisoners were fed adequately, housed properly, given access to medical care, allowed to send and receive mail, provided with recreation opportunities. He enforced the Geneva Convention completely, not selectively. When the Red Cross inspected the camp, their reports were glowing. One inspector noted, "Colonel Morrison appears to view the Geneva Convention not as a minimum standard, but as a baseline to exceed wherever possible. His prisoners are not merely surviving, they're living with dignity." Today, very few people know about the Buddhist ceremonies at Angel Island. The story hasn't entered the popular consciousness the way other World War II prisoner tales have. There's no movie, no famous photograph, no dramatic escape or rescue. Just a colonel who said yes when he could have said no. Just guards who protected prayers instead of disrupting them. Just prisoners who discovered that their enemies could surprise them with decency. Educational curricula rarely included. Documentaries about the Pacific War focus on major battles and strategic decisions. The Angel Island story is too quiet, too subtle, too ambiguous. It doesn't provide clear heroes and villains. It suggests that goodness and cruelty coexisted, that individuals made choices that defined their character regardless of their nation's actions. But for those who know the story, it resonates with profound significance. It demonstrates that principles matter, that laws protecting human rights are meaningless unless enforced even for enemies, that respect across boundaries is possible even in war. Yamamoto died in 2003 at 84. His funeral was held at a Buddhist temple in Kyoto, the city he'd left as a young soldier 6 decades earlier. His family placed his grandmother's Buddha in the casket with him, the tiny wooden figure that had traveled across oceans and through war, that had been examined by an American guard and returned, that had sat on makeshift altars in a prison camp where enemies protected faith. His son, giving the eulogy, told the Angel Island story one final time. He described his father's gratitude to Morrison, his respect for the guards who'd protected ceremonies, his belief that the war had taught him as much about humanity's potential for good as its capacity for evil. "My father could have spent his life angry," the son said. "He had reason. His country defeated, his youth consumed by war, years of his life spent in captivity. But instead, he spent his life grateful that someone had protected his faith when they didn't have to. Grateful that his darkest time had also been a time of unexpected grace. He taught us that bitterness is a choice, and gratitude is a choice, and we must choose wisely because that choice shapes everything that follows." In his final years, Yamamoto gave talks at schools about reconciliation and understanding. He always told the Angel Island story. He described the moment when the guard handed back his Buddha, when Colonel Morrison approved the first ceremony, when Private Brooks asked about the meaning of the chants. And he'd tell students, "War teaches us to hate. But sometimes, if we're lucky, we meet people who teach us something else, who show us that our enemies are human, who protect what's sacred even when they don't have to. Those people change history, not through great battles, but through small acts of respect." One student asked, "But sir, if the Americans were so good to you, does that mean Japan was wrong to fight them?" Yamamoto considered the question carefully. The war was complicated. Both sides made terrible choices. Both sides committed atrocities. But individuals within those systems could still choose decency. Colonel Morrison didn't end the war. He didn't prevent the bombing of Japanese cities. But he protected our prayers. That didn't make the war right or wrong. It made him a good man in a bad situation. That's all any of us can hope to be. The bell his fellow prisoners gave to Morrison's daughter now sits in a museum in Virginia, a quiet testament to an extraordinary moment. Visitors often walk past it without noticing. It's small, unadorned, easy to miss among more dramatic artifacts. But those who stop and read the inscription encounter something powerful. Evidence that even in humanity's darkest hours, some people choose to be better than they have to be. The museum curator, arranging the display, placed the bell next to Morrison's uniform and medals. A small plaque explains its significance. Most visitors spend 30 seconds reading it before moving on. But occasionally, someone stops longer. Reads the inscription multiple times, asks questions, and in those moments, the story lives again. One visitor, a young Marine about to deploy, stood in front of the bell for 10 minutes. The curator approached and asked if he was okay. The Marine said, "I'm trying to understand how you treat enemies with respect, how you follow the rules when everyone would understand if you didn't, how you stay human when war makes that so hard." The curator, who'd heard the Angel Island story dozens of times while researching the exhibit, said, "I think Morrison would tell you it's not about being extraordinary. It's about remembering that rules exist for a reason, especially when following them is difficult. That's when they matter most." October 1943, Camp Angel Island. Japanese prisoners expected their Buddhist practices to be forbidden. When the American commander not only allowed ceremonies, but posted guards to ensure respect, something unprecedented happened. Faith survived captivity. Enemies learned respect. And for a brief moment in the midst of total war, humanity triumphed over hatred. Not because the war ended, not because anyone surrendered their principles, but because one colonel decided that the law meant something, that dignity mattered, that even enemies deserved to pray. And in that decision, in those protected ceremonies, in those guards standing watch over chanted sutras, something sacred was preserved. Not just Buddhism, not just American values, but the possibility that we can remain human, even when everything pushes us to become monsters. That's the real story of Angel Island. Not that Americans were kind to prisoners, though they were. Not that Japanese soldiers found redemption, though many did. But that, in the space between captor and captive, between enemy and enemy, a choice was made to honor what connected them instead of only what divided them. And that choice echoed across decades, proving that even in war, respect is possible. Even behind barbed wire, faith can flourish. Even between enemies, dignity can survive. If someone had told Yamamoto, as he clutched his grandmother's Buddha on that transport ship in October 1943, that an American officer would protect his prayers, he would have called them a liar. If someone had told Morrison, as he took command of Angel Island, that guarding Buddhist ceremonies would become his defining legacy, he would have laughed. Neither man sought what happened, but both chose it when the moment came. And in that choice, quietly, without fanfare, they proved something the war tried to destroy, that our common humanity is stronger than our hatred. That faith can be protected even by those who don't share it. That the law, when applied with compassion, can create spaces for grace. That enemies, when treated with dignity, can become teachers. And that sometimes the most powerful victories aren't won on battlefields, but in the small moments when we choose to honor the sacred in those we're supposed to despise. The story asks something of us, even now. It asks whether we'd make Morrison's choice, whether we'd protect the rights of people we're supposed to hate, whether we'd follow principles when abandoning them would be easier and more popular. Whether we'd guard not just bodies of our body, but souls. These aren't hypothetical questions. In every generation, in every conflict, these choices appear. Not always as dramatically as Buddhist ceremonies in a POW camp, but with the same essential challenge. Will you be human, even when inhumane is expected? Will you respect dignity, even when cruelty is permitted? Will you choose the harder right over the easier wrong? Morrison answered yes. Yamamoto answered yes by continuing to practice his faith despite shame and fear. Brooks answered yes by asking questions instead of nurturing hatred. Hayashi answered yes by teaching compassion even to his captors. Each choice, small in itself, combined into something that changed lives and echoed across decades. That's the power of choosing humanity. Not grand gestures that reshape history, but consistent small choices that reshape souls. Angel Island didn't end the war. It didn't prevent atrocities. It didn't solve the fundamental problems that created the conflict. But it proved that even in war's midst, spaces for dignity could exist. And that proof, that evidence, that memory, it matters. Because it shows us what's possible, what we're capable of, even in darkness, what we might become if we choose wisely. The wooden Buddha still exists somewhere, passed down through Yamamoto's family. The bell sits in its museum case. The island remains, now peaceful, visited by tourists who don't know its history. The buildings are gone. The barbed wire is gone. The guards and prisoners are nearly all gone, but the story survives. Passed from generation to generation, told in classrooms and temples, in military academies and peace studies courses. It survives because it offers something rare: evidence of grace in graceless times, proof that legal principles matter, demonstration that respect across enemy lines is achievable, hope that we're capable of being better than circumstances demand. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's everything. Because in a world that still creates enemies, that still divides us, that still asks us to hate, we need these stories. We need to remember that Colonel Morrison existed, that Yamamoto existed, that guards protected prayers, and prisoners expressed gratitude, and enemies discovered their shared humanity. We need to remember because someday we might face our own version of Morrison's choice. Our own moment when we must decide whether principles matter, whether dignity is worth protecting, whether the harder right is worth choosing over the easier wrong. When that moment comes, and it will come, in ways large or small, we'll remember an island in San Francisco Bay, a colonel who said yes, guards who stood watch, prisoners who prayed, a bell that rang, a Buddha that survived, and faith that flourished, impossibly behind wire, proving that even in humanity's darkest hours, light can survive if someone chooses to protect it. That's the legacy of Angel Island. Not the buildings or battles, but the choice to be human, to honor the sacred, to respect the enemy, to follow the law, to protect dignity, to guard not just prisoners, but their souls. And in that choice, everything changed. Not history. The war would have ended the same way, regardless. But hearts changed. Yamamoto's, Morrison's, Brooks's. Every prisoner who prayed, every guard who protected, every Samaritan who later heard the story and wondered whether they'd have the courage to make the same choice. We're still wondering, still choosing, still deciding in each moment whether to honor human dignity or abandon it, whether to respect faith or dismiss it, whether to see enemies as human or monsters, whether to follow principles or convenience. Angel Island can't make those choices for us, but it can remind us that choosing humanity is possible, that respect across boundaries is achievable, that even in war, grace can survive, that the law, when followed with compassion, protects what matters most, and that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons, but with choices. Quiet, daily choices to honor what's sacred, protect what's vulnerable, respect what's different. And remember that beneath every uniform, every flag, every ideology, every boundary that divides us, there are human souls deserving of dignity. That was true in October 1943. It remains true now. It will be true tomorrow, when we face our own choices about how to treat those we're supposed to hate. Whether to follow principles when abandoning them is easier. Whether to guard not just bodies, but souls. Morrison showed us it's possible. Yamamoto showed us it matters. Together, they proved that even enemies can protect faith, that even war can contain grace, and that even in darkness, the sacred can survive, if someone, somewhere chooses to protect it.